He invited his divorced ex-wife to his wedding as a cruel joke. Intending to mock her, to his complete surprise, she accepted the invitation and arrived at the ceremony. She confidently entered with her new husband and their twin children, completely turning the tables on his attempt at humiliation. The sleek black Tesla Model S glided silently into the circular driveway of the Montecito estate, its chrome details catching the late afternoon California sun. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion, wedding guests paused their champagne conversations to watch the unexpected arrival. Sarah Matthews stepped out of the driver's seat with practiced elegance, her designer navy dress, a custom Armani that hugged her transformed figure perfectly, flowing like liquid silk. At 32, she radiated the kind of confidence that money couldn't buy but suffering could forge. Her auburn hair, now styled in a sophisticated chignon, caught golden highlights that framed a face that had learned to smile again. But it wasn't Sarah who caused the collective intake of breath from the terrace onlookers. "Mommy, is this where Daddy used to live?" The voice belonged to Emma, a cherubic 4-year-old with Sarah's green eyes and an innocent curiosity that could melt hearts. She emerged from the passenger side, her tiny hand reaching for her mother's. "No, sweetheart," Sarah replied, her voice steady as granite. "This is just where we're visiting today." From the other side of the car, David, Emma's twin brother, bounded out with the endless energy of childhood, his Superman t-shirt slightly wrinkled from the car seat. Both children bore the unmistakable evidence of Sarah's supposed infertility, the very condition that had been weaponized against her for 3 excruciating years. The car's remaining door opened, and Dr. James Harrison stepped out, adjusting his charcoal suit jacket. Tall, distinguished, with graying temples that added gravitas to his warm brown eyes, he moved with the quiet confidence of a successful pediatric surgeon. His hand found Sarah's lower back, a gesture both protective and proud. "You sure you're ready for this?" he murmured, his voice carrying the slight accent of his Boston upbringing. Sarah's smile was razor-sharp. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." Inside the mansion, through the imported Italian marble foyer and past the walls adorned with photographs of the happy couple, the wedding reception was in full swing. Michael Barrett, now Michael Barrett Chen, having taken his new wife's hyphenated name, stood near the champagne fountain, regaling his college fraternity brothers with another embellished story about his business acumen. At 35, Michael had maintained his athletic build through expensive personal trainers, though his hairline had begun its inevitable retreat. His smile, once charming enough to convince a young graduate student to marry him, now carried the practiced insincerity of a man who had learned to manipulate truth as easily as breathing. And so I told the client, "Look, in commercial real estate, timing is everything." And boom, closed a $2 million deal the next day, he was saying, gesturing with his champagne flute when his wife, Linda Chen Barrett, appeared at his elbow. Linda was everything Michael had claimed to want: petite, successful in her own right as a tech marketing executive, and 5 months pregnant with the child that would prove his fertility to anyone who might have doubted it. Her black hair was pulled into an elegant updo, and her maternity dress, though expensive, couldn't hide the slight strain around her eyes that came from living with a man who needed constant validation. "Michael," she said quietly, "there's someone here to see you." His face clouded with confusion. "What do you mean? Everyone on the guest list is already—" "Sarah's here." The champagne flute slipped from Michael's fingers, shattering against the travertine floor with a crystalline crash that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet reception area. Conversations paused mid-sentence as heads turned toward the commotion. "That's impossible," he whispered, his face draining of color. She can't." But Linda's grim expression confirmed his worst fears. Through the arched doorway that led to the foyer, they could see her, Sarah Matthews, the woman he had systematically destroyed, the wife he had convinced everyone was mentally unstable and hopelessly infertile, standing in his home like an avenging angel dressed in designer couture. And she wasn't alone. The children flanked her like living proof of every lie he had ever told. The distinguished man beside her wore no wedding ring, but the way he stood, protective, proud, completely devoted, announced their relationship louder than any jewelry could. Michael's mother, Patricia Barrett, approached from across the room, her face a mask of polite confusion that barely concealed her shock. "Michael, dear, I thought you said Sarah was—" "Well, that she couldn't." The sentence hung in the air, unfinished, but perfectly understood by everyone within earshot. The woman who was supposedly too damaged to maintain a marriage, too broken to bear children, too unstable for civilized society, had just walked into their carefully constructed narrative and shattered it as thoroughly as the champagne glass at their feet. Sarah's gaze found Michael's across the crowded room, and for a moment, time suspended itself. In her eyes, he saw no anger, no bitterness, no trace of the broken woman he remembered from their divorce proceedings 3 years ago. Instead, he saw something far more terrifying, complete and utter indifference. She had moved on. She had thrived. And her very presence here, elegant, successful, surrounded by the family he had convinced everyone she could never have, was about to unravel every carefully crafted lie he had built his new life upon. The perfect revenge had arrived, and it looked exactly like the happiness he had tried to steal from her. 3 years earlier, Sarah had always imagined that trying to conceive would be romantic. Stolen moments of intimacy, whispered hopes about baby names, the shared joy of creating life together. Instead, it had become a clinical obsession that consumed every aspect of her marriage to Michael Barrett. Their Cambridge apartment, a modest 2-bedroom near Harvard Square where Sarah was completing her MBA, had transformed into a shrine to fertility. Ovulation prediction kits cluttered the bathroom counter. Basal thermometers lived on the nightstand, and a color-coded calendar tracked her cycles with mathematical precision. What had started as excited anticipation during their first year of marriage had slowly morphed into desperate calculation. "Temperature's up," Sarah announced from the bathroom on a cold February morning, her breath visible in the poorly heated apartment. "This could be it." Michael's response came muffled through the bedroom wall. "Can't today, babe. Henderson wants me in the office early for the Morrison closing." Sarah stared at herself in the bathroom mirror, noting the dark circles under her green eyes, the way her cheekbones had become more pronounced as stress stole her appetite. At 29, she should have been glowing with possibility. Instead, she looked like a woman at war with her own body. This scene had played out countless times over the past 18 months. The perfectly timed opportunities missed for client meetings, business dinners, or Michael's various networking events. His real estate career was ascending rapidly. He'd moved from a small firm to Barrett and Associates, where his charm and aggressive sales tactics made him a rising star. Success, he reminded her constantly, required sacrifice. "But the timing," she began. "Sarah." His voice carried that edge of irritation she'd learned to recognize and fear. "We've talked about this. You can't expect me to drop everything every time your app tells you to. That's not how babies are made." But that's exactly how babies are made, she thought, biting back the words that would only start another fight. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, her gynecologist, had been clear. Timing was crucial, especially as they moved into their second year of trying. Every missed opportunity felt like another month stolen from their future. Michael emerged from the bedroom, already dressed in his expensive suit, a recent purchase celebrating his latest commission. He kissed her forehead with the distracted affection of a man whose mind was already at the office. "Look, we'll try tonight, okay? But I need you to stop being so intense about this. It's putting pressure on both of us." Pressure. The word had become his favorite weapon, deployed whenever her needs conflicted with his schedule. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was the one bearing the physical and emotional burden of their fertility journey. Yet somehow she was also responsible for making it easier for him. After he left, Sarah sat on their unmade bed, staring at the fertility calendar. Red X's marked the days they'd missed optimal windows. Green stars indicated the increasingly rare occasions when everything aligned. The pattern was becoming undeniable, though she wasn't ready to see it yet. His availability seemed inversely related to her fertility. By their second anniversary, the missed opportunities had multiplied. Michael's career continued its upward trajectory. He'd been featured in Boston Business Journal as one of the city's rising stars under 35. His success brought longer hours, more networking events, weekend conferences that coincided with her ovulation windows with disturbing regularity. "Maybe we should see a specialist," Sarah suggested over dinner at Legal Seafoods, where they were celebrating his latest promotion. The restaurant buzzed with the energy of young professionals, couples like them who seemed to navigate life with easy confidence. Michael's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "A specialist? Sarah, we've only been trying for 2 years. That's completely normal. Dr. Walsh says after 18 months it's worth getting checked. Just to rule out any issues?" "Issues?" His voice rose slightly, causing the couple at the next table to glance over. "Are you saying there's something wrong with me?" "No, I just meant both of us. They test both partners. It's routine." Michael set down his fork, his jaw tightening in that way that signaled an approaching storm. "I don't need some doctor telling me I'm broken, Sarah. And frankly, I'm getting tired of you treating our marriage like a medical emergency." The accusation hit like a physical blow. "That's not what I'm doing, isn't it? When's the last time we had sex just because we wanted to? When's the last time you didn't check your stupid app afterward? You've turned our bedroom into a laboratory?" Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks as she noticed the other diner's sideways glances. Michael had a gift for making private arguments feel public, for weaponizing her embarrassment to end conversations he didn't want to have. "I just want to have a baby with you," she whispered. "And I want to have a wife who doesn't schedule our intimacy like a business meeting." That night, lying in their bed with Michael's back turned toward her in sleep, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to identify when everything had gone wrong. When had her desire to build a family become an obsession? When had Michael's support turned into resentment? The truth was simpler and more painful than she wanted to admit. Michael had never really wanted children. Not the way she did. He'd agreed to start trying because it was what couples did after marriage, but he'd never imagined it would require actual effort or sacrifice on his part. Every failed month was evidence that the universe was saving him from a responsibility he'd never truly wanted to embrace. But Sarah couldn't see that yet. Instead, she internalized his criticism, believing that her desperation was somehow toxic, that her biological clock was a character flaw rather than a natural drive. She began to apologize for wanting what they'd agreed to pursue together. The appointments with Dr. Walsh became exercises in humiliation. Michael accompanied her reluctantly, checking his phone during consultations and sighing audibly when the doctor discussed timing and frequency. When Dr. Walsh suggested they track ovulation more carefully, Michael rolled his eyes. "Doctor, with respect, we're not rabbits. We're going to have sex when we feel like it, not when some chart tells us to." Dr. Walsh's expression remained professional, but Sarah caught the flicker of concern in her eyes. In her 15 years of practice, she'd seen this dynamic before: partners who undermined the process, who turned fertility struggles into relationship warfare. "Mr. Barrett, I understand this can feel clinical, but statistics show that couples who time intercourse with ovulation have significantly higher success rates." "Statistics," Michael interrupted. "Right. Well, here's a statistic for you. Stress is a major factor in infertility. And all this pressure, all these schedules and thermometers and apps, that's stress. Maybe if Sarah could just relax and let nature take its course?" The suggestion hung in the air like an accusation. If Sarah could just relax, as if her anxiety about their 18 months of failure was the problem, not their failure itself. As if her perfectly normal concern about their reproductive timeline was neurotic behavior that needed correction. Walking to the car after the appointment, Sarah felt the familiar weight of shame settling on her shoulders. "Maybe he's right," she said quietly. "Maybe I am too intense about this." Dr. Walsh stopped walking. "Sarah, can I ask you something? How often are you having intercourse during your fertile window?" The question was clinical, but Sarah's face burned with embarrassment. "It varies. Michael's work schedule is pretty demanding." "I see. And how often would you say you miss your optimal days due to scheduling conflicts?" Sarah did the math in her head, her heart sinking with the calculation. Maybe 60% of the time? Dr. Walsh nodded slowly. Sarah, I want you to know that your desire to optimize your chances of conception is not only normal, it's smart. Couples who actively track ovulation and time intercourse accordingly are 3 times more likely to conceive within 6 months than those who don't. Your approach isn't the problem. But as they drove home in silence, Michael's frustration filled the car like toxic smoke. I hope you're happy, he said finally. Now she thinks I'm not doing my job as a husband. She didn't say that. She didn't have to. The way she looked at me when you said we miss most of your optimal days, like I'm some kind of selfish asshole who won't perform on command. Sarah stared out the passenger window at the Cambridge streets, watching couples walk hand in hand, wondering if any of them were having this conversation. I never said you had to perform on command. You don't have to say it. Sarah, it's written all over your face every time I'm tired or stressed or just want to have a normal relationship with my wife instead of being treated like a sperm donor. The cruelty of the words took her breath away. In 18 months of trying, Michael had never once referred to their attempts to conceive as making love, creating life, or building their family. To him, it was always performing, doing his job, or being treated like a sperm donor. That night, as she lay awake listening to Michael's satisfied breathing, Sarah began to suspect that their fertility problems might not be medical at all. They might be deliberate, but it would take another year of gaslighting, another year of being called obsessive and demanding, another year of missing ovulation windows due to Michael's mysteriously timed business commitments, before she would be ready to face that devastating possibility. For now, she internalized his criticism and began the slow process of believing that her desire for children was somehow pathological, that her frustration with their failure was evidence of her own inadequacy as a wife. The foundation for her psychological destruction was being laid, brick by brick, with every conversation that made her the problem and him the victim of her unreasonable expectations. 2.5 years. Earlier, the fertility clinic on Longwood Medical Avenue gleamed with the sterile promise of modern medicine. Dr. Richard Steinberg, one of Boston's most respected reproductive endocrinologists, had agreed to see them after Dr. Walsh's referral. Sarah sat in the waiting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Michael scrolled through his phone with obvious irritation. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice despite the other couples nearby. "We're going to spend thousands of dollars for some doctor to tell us what we already know. There's nothing wrong with either of us except your stress levels." A woman across the room glanced up from her magazine, her expression sympathetic. Sarah wanted to disappear into the expensive upholstery. This was how it always went with Michael. Her private struggles became public embarrassments. Her concerns transformed into character flaws that reflected poorly on both of them. "Mrs. Barrett?" A nurse appeared with a clipboard. "Dr. Steinberg will see you now." The consultation room was designed to feel warm and hopeful, with soft lighting and artwork depicting families. Dr. Steinberg, a distinguished man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, reviewed their file with practiced efficiency. "So you've been trying to conceive for approximately 24 months, he said, looking between them. Dr. Walsh has provided excellent preliminary workup. "Sarah, your hormone levels look good, your cycles are regular, but I'd like to run some additional tests on both of you to get a complete picture." Michael shifted in his chair. "What kind of tests?" "For you, a comprehensive semen analysis. It's standard protocol. We need to evaluate sperm count, motility, morphology. For Sarah, we'll do an HSG to check fallopian tube patency, along with more detailed hormone panels." "A semen analysis," Michael repeated, his voice flat. "It's completely routine, Mr. Barrett. About 40% of fertility issues involve male factors, so we always check both partners." Sarah watched her husband's face transform. The easy charm he deployed with clients and colleagues vanished, replaced by something cold and defensive. "And if there's a problem? What then?" "That depends on what we find. There are many treatment options available today." "I don't want treatment. Michael stood abruptly. I want to know if there's actually a problem before we start throwing around solutions. Dr. Steinberg's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes. After 20 years in reproductive medicine, he'd learned to read the dynamics between couples. Of course. Let's start with the tests and see what we're working with. The drive home was silent until they reached their street. Then Michael exploded. I can't believe you're making me go through this humiliation. Humiliation? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. It's just a test. Just a test? Sarah, do you have any idea what it's like for a man to have his virility questioned? To have some doctor imply that I might be defective? Defective. The word hit her like a slap. It was the same word he'd been using to describe her fears about their inability to conceive. Now, faced with the possibility that the problem might be his, he understood exactly how devastating that label could be. No one's questioning your virility, she said carefully. Dr. Steinberg said it's routine. Routine for couples with problems. Routine for men who can't do the one thing they're biologically programmed to do. Sarah turned to study his profile as he stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. For the first time in their marriage, she was seeing Michael vulnerable. Not the confident salesman who charmed clients and dominated rooms, but a man terrified of being found inadequate. Michael, whatever the tests show, we'll deal with it together. That's what marriage means. He looked at her then, and something in his expression made her stomach clench with unease. Is it, Sarah? Because for the past 2 years, you've made this about what's wrong with us, what we need to fix, how we need to try harder. When did our marriage become a problem to be solved? The accusation was so perfectly inverted, so skillfully manipulative, that Sarah felt her reality shift. Wasn't she the one who'd been trying to solve their problem? Wasn't she the one who'd been suggesting doctors and tests while he avoided and deflected? But the way he said it made her sound like the aggressor, the one who'd turned their love into a medical mission. I just want us to have a family, she said weakly. And I want us to be happy. But apparently, those two things are mutually exclusive. That night, Michael slept on the couch to avoid the pressure. Sarah lay awake in their bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering when wanting children had become such a terrible thing in her husband's eyes. The next morning, she found him in the kitchen, dressed for work and pouring coffee into his travel mug with practiced efficiency. I've been thinking about what Dr. Steinberg said, he announced without preamble. About the tests. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest. And? I'll do it. But I want something in return. The way he said it, like a business negotiation rather than a medical necessity, set off alarm bells in her mind. What kind of something? I want you to see a therapist. About your obsession with getting pregnant. The coffee mug slipped from Sarah's fingers, shattering against the kitchen tile in an explosion of ceramic and caffeine. My obsession? Sarah, look at yourself. Look at what you've turned our marriage into. Charts and schedules and temperature checks. When's the last time we just enjoyed being together? When's the last time you talked about anything besides ovulation and hormone levels? She stared at the broken pieces of her favorite mug scattered across the floor, seeing a metaphor she wasn't ready to acknowledge. I talk about other things. Do you? Because I can't remember the last conversation we had that didn't somehow circle back to babies. It's like you've forgotten that I fell in love with Sarah the person, not Sarah the potential mother. The manipulation was masterful. He took her legitimate medical concerns and reframed them as pathology. Her reasonable desire to optimize their chances became evidence of mental instability. Her frustration with their lack of success became proof that she was no longer the woman he'd married. If I see a therapist, you'll do the semen analysis? Deal. He kissed her forehead, the gesture feeling more like a business handshake than an expression of love. I'm doing this for us, Sarah, but I need you to work on your part of the problem too. Your part of the problem. As if their failure to conceive was her fault, her obsession, her psychological deficiency that needed professional correction. Dr. Amanda Foster's therapy office in Harvard Square was warm and welcoming, filled with plants and soft textures that were supposed to create a safe space for emotional exploration. Sarah had chosen her carefully, a specialist in fertility-related stress and relationship dynamics. "Tell me about your marriage," Dr. Foster said during their first session. "How would you describe your relationship with Michael?" "It used to be wonderful," Sarah said, then corrected herself. "It is wonderful. It's just the fertility stuff has put some strain on us." "What kind of strain?" Sarah found herself repeating Michael's criticisms as if they were objective facts. She was too focused on getting pregnant. She'd turned their bedroom into a laboratory. She was so obsessed with timing that she'd forgotten how to be spontaneous. She'd become difficult to live with. Dr. Foster listened without judgment, taking notes occasionally. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Do you think your desire to have children is pathological? I don't know anymore. Michael says I'm obsessed. What do you think?" The question hung in the air. What did Sarah think, stripped of Michael's interpretations and accusations? When was the last time she'd trusted her own perspective on their situation? "I think I want to be a mother," she said finally. "And I think 2 years of trying without success is long enough to seek medical help. But Michael makes me feel like that's wrong somehow." "How does he make you feel that way?" Sarah described the missed ovulation windows, the business trips that coincidentally aligned with her fertile days, the way Michael turned her medical appointments into relationship problems. As she talked, Dr. Foster's expression grew increasingly concerned. "Sarah, I've worked with many couples dealing with fertility issues. What you're describing, tracking ovulation, timing intercourse, seeking medical evaluation after 2 years, that's not obsessive behavior. That's exactly what I would recommend to any couple in your situation." The validation felt like oxygen after years of suffocation. "Really? Really? But I'm more concerned about something else. You mentioned that Michael seems to have scheduling conflicts during your fertile windows. How often would you say this happens?" Sarah did the math, her heart sinking with each calculation. "Almost always. Maybe 8 times out of 10. "And how does he respond when you point out these patterns?" "He says I'm being paranoid, that I'm trying to control his career, that I'm making him feel like a performing animal." Dr. Foster set down her pen, her expression grave. "Sarah, I want you to consider the possibility that these scheduling conflicts aren't coincidental." The words hit like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "In my experience, when one partner consistently avoids fertile windows while simultaneously blaming the other partner for being obsessed with conception, it often indicates ambivalence about having children, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious. But Michael wants children. We've talked about it. What has he said specifically about wanting children?" Sarah searched her memory, trying to find concrete evidence of Michael's desire to be a father. But when she reached for specific conversations, specific moments when he'd expressed excitement about their future family, she came up empty. He agreed to try. When I brought it up after our first anniversary, he agreed to try. But has he ever expressed enthusiasm about becoming a father? Has he talked about baby names or imagined what kind of parent he'd be, or shown excitement about the possibility of pregnancy? The silence stretched between them as Sarah confronted a truth she'd been avoiding for months. Michael had never wanted children. He'd agreed to try because it was expected, because saying no would have made him look selfish. But he'd been sabotaging their efforts from the beginning, then blaming her for their failure. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "I think I need to have a very difficult conversation with my husband." But when she got home that evening, Michael was waiting with flowers and her favorite takeout from the Italian place in Little Italy. He'd lit candles and put on the playlist from their honeymoon. "I've been thinking about what you said," he announced, pulling out her chair with theatrical chivalry. "About how I haven't been supportive enough? I want to make this right." The whiplash from his morning coldness to evening romance would have been suspicious if Sarah hadn't been so desperate for any sign of connection. He spent the evening being the charming man she'd fallen in love with, attentive, funny, physically affectionate. "I scheduled the semen analysis for next week," he said as they cleaned up the dishes together. "And I want you to know, whatever the results show, we're going to figure this out together." Relief flooded through her. This was the Michael she'd married, the partner she'd believed would support her through anything. The man who made her doubt her therapist's concerns and her own growing suspicions. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest as he held her. "I was starting to think, what? That I didn't want this?" He pulled back to look at her, his expression hurt. "Sarah, of course I want this. I want to give you everything you've ever dreamed of. I just needed some time to wrap my head around the medical stuff." That night, they made love for the first time in weeks without consulting her ovulation app or checking her temperature. It felt like a return to who they used to be, a promise that they could survive this challenge together. But the next morning, while Michael showered, Sarah found his phone buzzing with notifications on the nightstand. The preview screen showed a text from someone named Linda. "Can't wait to see you at the conference this weekend. Room 412. Her blood turned to ice. Michael had told her he was going to a real estate conference in New York, alone for work, during what would be her fertile window this month. With shaking fingers, she scrolled through the message thread. Months of flirtatious exchanges, plans for hotel meetings, intimate photos that made her stomach turn. The conference was real, but Michael wouldn't be attending seminars. He'd been having an affair for at least 6 months, possibly longer. And he'd been timing his infidelity to coincide with her ovulation, ensuring that their attempts to conceive would fail while he pursued another woman. The psychological manipulation was even more calculated than Dr. Foster had suspected. Michael wasn't just ambivalent about having children. He was actively preventing conception while making Sarah believe she was the problem. She sat on their bed, his phone in her trembling hands, and realized that everything she'd believed about their marriage was a lie. The phone felt like a live wire in Sarah's hands as she stared at the intimate photos Linda had sent Michael. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Her husband's body intertwined with another woman's. Timestamps showing these images were taken during his supposed business trips over the past 6 months. The shower was still running. She had maybe 3 minutes before Michael emerged, and she needed to think. Her first instinct was to confront him immediately, to throw the phone at his face and demand answers. But something Dr. Foster had said during their last session stopped her. Documentation is power. Sarah, if you ever suspect you're being manipulated, gather evidence before confronting the manipulator. With shaking fingers, she forwarded the most damning messages to her own email, deleted the forwarded messages from Michael's sent folder, and placed the phone exactly where she'd found it. Then she sat on their bed and tried to breathe through the sensation that her entire world was collapsing. The affair explained everything: the missed fertile windows, the emotional distance, the way he'd made her feel crazy for wanting what they'd supposedly been working toward together. While she'd been charting her cycles and optimizing their chances of conception, he'd been actively ensuring their failure by giving his attention to another woman. Michael emerged from the bathroom with a towel wrapped around his waist, humming the song from last night's romantic dinner. The casual happiness on his face, the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd successfully manipulated his wife back into compliance, made Sarah's stomach turn. "Morning, beautiful," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Sleep well?" She managed to nod, not trusting her voice. How had she never noticed how patronizing that pet name sounded? How condescending his tone was when he spoke to her like she was a child who needed managing. "I've got that conference this weekend," he said, pulling clothes from their shared dresser. "But when I get back, I promise we'll focus on us. Maybe plan a little getaway before we jump back into the baby-making business." Baby-making business. Even now, after their supposed reconciliation, he couldn't bring himself to call it starting a family or having children. It was business, a transaction that inconvenienced him. "Sounds perfect," she managed, the words tasting like ash. After he left for work, Sarah sat in their apartment and tried to piece together the timeline of her psychological destruction. When had the affair started? How long had Michael been deliberately sabotaging their fertility efforts while making her believe she was the problem? She opened her laptop and began methodically reviewing their shared calendar, cross-referencing Michael's travel dates with her fertility tracking app. The pattern was even more damning than she'd feared. Every single one of his Overnight trips in the past 8 months had coincided with her ovulation windows. Every single one. The precision of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a man who'd fallen into an affair and was juggling competing commitments. This was calculated sabotage, timed specifically to ensure she wouldn't conceive while maintaining plausible deniability about his absence. Her phone rang, startling her from her analysis. Dr. Foster's name appeared on the screen. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me calling. I've been thinking about our session yesterday and I wanted to check in. How did your conversation with Michael go?" Sarah's carefully constructed composure crumbled. "I didn't have it. But I found something else. He's having an affair." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Dr. Foster spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "How did you find out?" Sarah explained about the texts, the photos, the pattern of travel dates that aligned perfectly with her fertile windows. As she talked, she could hear Dr. Foster typing notes. "Sarah, I need to ask you a difficult question. Are you safe? Is there any possibility that Michael might become violent if confronted?" The question caught her off guard. "Violent? No, Michael isn't. He's never hit me or anything. Physical violence isn't the only kind of danger. Emotional and psychological abuse can escalate when the abuser realizes they're losing control. Based on what you've described, Michael has been systematically gaslighting you for months, making you doubt your own perceptions and sanity. That level of manipulation suggests someone who will go to great lengths to maintain their version of reality." Gaslighting. Sarah had heard the term but never applied it to her own situation. She'd thought gaslighting was dramatic, obvious, like someone denying events that clearly happened. She hadn't recognized the subtle erosion of her confidence, the way Michael had gradually made her distrust her own instincts and needs. "What should I do?" "First, document everything. Save those messages, print them if you can. Keep a journal of your discoveries. Second, don't confront him until you have a safety plan. Do you have somewhere you could stay if you needed to leave quickly?" Sarah thought about her support network, which had shrunk considerably during her marriage. Michael had a way of making her friends feel unwelcome, not through overt hostility, but through subtle dismissiveness, pointed comments about their lifestyle choices, strategic scheduling of his events during her social commitments. "My sister Amy lives in Connecticut, but I can't just leave without—" "Sarah, you can leave whenever you want. You don't need his permission to protect yourself." The concept was so foreign it took several seconds to sink in. For 3 years, she'd operated under the assumption that marriage meant negotiating every decision, that leaving would require Michael's agreement or understanding. The idea that she could simply choose to go felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. That weekend, while Michael was at his conference with Linda, Sarah methodically searched their apartment for evidence of his deception. What she found was worse than adultery. It was evidence of a man who'd been carefully constructing her psychological prison for years. In his home office, tucked behind his college textbooks, she found a manila folder labeled Insurance Medical. Inside were documents that made her blood freeze. Michael's semen analysis results from Dr. Steinberg's clinic, dated 2 weeks earlier. The results were devastating. Severe oligospermia, extremely low sperm count, poor motility, abnormal morphology. According to the report, Michael's chances of natural conception were less than 5%. The doctor's notes recommended immediate intervention with fertility treatments, possibly IVF. Michael had known for 2 weeks that he was the primary cause of their fertility problems, and instead of sharing this information with her, instead of discussing treatment options, he'd hidden the results and continued to let her believe she was the problem. But there was more. Beneath the recent test results were older documents, medical records from a clinic she'd never heard of, dated nearly a year earlier. Michael had been secretly testing his fertility for almost 12 months, long before their appointment with Dr. Steinberg. The timeline clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Michael had suspected he was infertile, gotten tested, confirmed his worst fears, and then spent months making Sarah believe she was obsessive and demanding, rather than admit he was the problem. The affair with Linda wasn't just betrayal, It was his escape hatch, his way of sabotaging their marriage before she could discover his infertility and leave him. Sarah sat on the floor of his office, surrounded by evidence of his elaborate deception, and realized she was married to a sociopath. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Missing you, beautiful. Conference is boring. Can't wait to come home and focus on us." The heart emoji, sent while he was in bed with another woman, felt like a physical slap. But beneath her hurt and rage, something else was emerging. A cold, calculating fury that surprised her with its clarity. Michael thought he was in control. He thought he'd successfully manipulated her into believing their fertility problems were her fault, her obsession, her psychological deficiency. He thought he could continue his affair while she blamed herself for their failing marriage. He was wrong. Sarah photographed every document in his secret folder, forwarded every incriminating text and email to her personal account, and began planning her exit strategy. But this wouldn't be a dramatic confrontation or an emotional breakdown. Michael had taught her something valuable during their 3 years of marriage. Manipulation was a game, and she was tired of being the only player who didn't know the rules. Monday morning, she called Dr. Steinberg's office. "This is Sarah Barrett. I believe you have test results for my husband that we never received." The nurse's confusion was audible. "Mrs. Barrett, your husband picked up his results 2 weeks ago. Didn't he share them with you? I'm afraid there's been some miscommunication. Could you help me understand what those results showed?" 20 minutes later, Sarah had official confirmation of what she'd already discovered. Michael was severely subfertile, and their 3 years of trying had been an elaborate charade designed to hide his inadequacy while destroying her self-worth. That evening, Michael returned from his conference with flowers and stories about boring seminars. He made dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and played the role of the devoted husband who'd spent the weekend missing his wife. "So," he said over dessert, "I've been thinking about what you said. About maybe taking a break from trying to get pregnant. Maybe you're right. Maybe we have been putting too much pressure on ourselves." Sarah looked at him across their dining table. This man who'd spent years convincing her she was broken, who'd hidden his own infertility while making her feel defective, who'd been cheating on her while she endured invasive medical procedures to fix a problem that was never hers. "Actually," she said, her voice steady as steel, "I think we should try harder. I think we should move forward with Dr. Steinberg's recommendations. Full fertility workup, aggressive treatment if necessary." Michael's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Sarah, I thought we agreed to work on this together. So let's work on it, all of it. Complete transparency, full medical intervention, whatever it takes." She watched him realize that his carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. If they pursued aggressive fertility treatment, his test results would have to be shared. His infertility would be exposed. His affair would be discovered when Dr. Steinberg asked why he'd picked up results without including her. "Maybe we should slow down," he said carefully. "Maybe we should focus on the relationship stuff first, like Dr. Foster suggested." "Oh, I've been working with Dr. Foster extensively," Sarah said, her smile sharp as a blade. "She's helped me understand so much about our dynamic, about manipulation and gaslighting, and how abusers isolate their victims." The word abuser hit Michael like a physical blow. His face went pale, then flushed red with anger. "Are you calling me an abuser?" "I'm calling you exactly what you are, Michael. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" The mask finally slipped. The charming, successful real estate agent disappeared, replaced by a cornered animal who'd been caught in his own trap. "You want to know what we're going to do about it?" he snarled. "I'll tell you exactly what we're going to do." And for the first time in their marriage, Sarah was about to see who her husband really was when he couldn't manipulate his way out of a corner. Michael's transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The charming facade he'd worn for 3 years evaporated like smoke, revealing something ugly and violent beneath. His hand slammed down on the dining table so hard that the wine glasses jumped, sending drops of Merlot across the white tablecloth like drops of blood. "You think you're so fucking smart, don't you?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a register Sarah had never heard before. "You think you've figured me out?" Sarah forced herself to remain calm, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. Dr. Foster's warnings about escalation echoed in her mind. "I know about Linda. I know about your test results. And I know you've been lying to me for over a year." Michael's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Linda? You think this is about Linda?" He stood up, towering over her seated form. "This is about you being a pathetic, desperate woman who can't accept that maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't medical, it's you." The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking, but Sarah had armor now, the truth. "The problem is medical, Michael. You're oligospermia, to be specific. Severe oligospermia, according to Dr. Steinberg's report. The one you picked up 2 weeks ago and hid from me?" Michael's face went white, then red, then white again. He looked like a man who'd just watched his entire world collapse in real time. "You went through my things? You invaded my privacy? I found medical records that directly affect my health and our marriage. Records you deliberately hid while continuing to make me believe I was infertile. You are infertile," he roared, spittle flying from his lips. 3 years, Sarah. 3 fucking years of trying, and what do we have to show for it? Nothing, because you're broken. I'm not broken. Sarah's voice was steady, each word falling like a stone. You are, and you've known it for months. Michael began pacing around the dining room like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair. Okay, fine. So what if I knew? What was I supposed to do, Sarah? Tell you that your husband is defective. Tell you that the man you married can't give you the one thing you want most in the world? For a moment, Sarah glimpsed the pain beneath his rage, the genuine anguish of a man discovering he couldn't father children. But it lasted only seconds before his narcissism reasserted itself. So yes, I handled it badly. But you have to understand, I was protecting you. I was protecting us. By having an affair? By giving you someone to blame other than me? The admission hung in the air like poison gas. Do you think I enjoyed watching you chart your cycles and take your temperature and get your hopes up month after month? Do you think I wanted to be the one to crush your dreams? Sarah stared at him in horror. So you made me crush them myself. You made me believe I was the failure. Because it was easier. Because it hurt less than admitting I'm the one who can't. His voice broke, and for a moment she saw the scared, inadequate man hiding behind the abuser's mask. But sympathy was a luxury she could no longer afford. Easier for whom, Michael? It was easier for you to watch me undergo invasive medical procedures? To let me blame myself for 3 years while you secretly knew the truth? To start an affair so you'd have an exit strategy when your lies were discovered? The affair isn't. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. You started sleeping with Linda because you needed a way out of this marriage that wouldn't make you look like the villain. If you could make me seem unstable and obsessive enough, if you could paint me as the crazy wife who was pressuring you about babies, then nobody would question why you left. Michael stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing with something that looked like grudging respect. You really have been talking to that therapist, haven't you? Dr. Foster helped me understand gaslighting. How abusers make their victims doubt their own reality. How they isolate and manipulate and... I never isolated you! When's the last time I had dinner with Amy? When's the last time I went out with my college friends without you finding some reason why I couldn't or shouldn't go? Michael's mouth opened and closed without sound. Sarah could see him mentally reviewing the past 3 years, perhaps recognizing his patterns of control for the first time. You made me smaller, she continued. Month by month, year by year. You made me doubt my instincts, my needs, my right to want children. You made me believe that my biological clock was a character flaw, that my desire for a family was an obsession that needed professional treatment. It was an obsession. Look what it did to our marriage! What it did to our marriage? Michael, you sabotaged our marriage from the moment you got those first test results. Everything since then has been you covering your tracks while destroying my self-worth. Michael slumped into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. So what now? You want a divorce? You want to take me for everything I'm worth? The defeated tone might have tugged at her heartstrings once, but Sarah had learned to recognize his emotional manipulation. This was performance, the wounded victim routine he deployed whenever his aggressive tactics failed. "What I want," she said clearly, "is for you to move out. Tonight." Tonight? "Sarah, be reasonable. I'm done being reasonable. I've been reasonable for 3 years while you systematically destroyed my mental health. I'm done." Michael's expression hardened. "Fine. But if that's how you want to play this, don't expect me to make it easy. You want a divorce? You'll get one. But I'm not going to let you destroy my reputation over some medical condition I can't control." The threat was clear. He was already preparing his narrative for their divorce. The story he'd tell friends and family about why their marriage ended. Sarah could practically hear his version. She became obsessed with getting pregnant. "It consumed our relationship. When we found out about my fertility issues, she couldn't handle it and abandoned me in my time of need." "Your reputation," she repeated softly. "After everything you've done, you're worried about your reputation. I have a business to protect. Clients who trust me. A life I've built that doesn't revolve around your need to be a mother." The casual cruelty of the statement took her breath away. Even now, facing the destruction of their marriage, he couldn't resist one more twisted knife, reducing her fundamental desire for children to a selfish whim that had inconvenienced him. "Pack your bags, Michael. Tonight." He stood up slowly, his expression cycling through rage, disbelief, and calculation. "You think you're going to come out of this looking like the victim? You think people won't see what you really are? A desperate woman who couldn't handle the reality that sometimes life doesn't give you what you want?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I think people will see exactly what happened when I show them your medical records and Linda's text messages." Michael's face went ashen. "You can't. Those are private communications." "Actually, I can. Massachusetts is a no-fault divorce state, but adultery still affects asset division. And lying about medical conditions that impact joint decision-making? That's fraud, Michael." She was bluffing about the legal implications. She had no idea what the actual ramifications would be. But Michael's guilty conscience filled in the blanks, and she could see him calculating the potential damage to his career and social standing. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll pack tonight. But Sarah, this isn't over. You want to play hardball? Let's play hardball." As he stalked upstairs to pack his belongings, Sarah sat alone at their dining table and tried to process what had just happened. 3 years of psychological manipulation had ended in a single conversation. The man she'd married, the charming salesman who'd swept her off her feet, was gone. If he'd ever existed at all. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "Just checking in. How are things?" For the first time in months, Sarah knew exactly how to answer that question. "Getting better," she typed back. "Getting much better." An hour later, Michael dragged 2 suitcases down the stairs, his face set in lines of bitter resentment. "I'll be staying at the Marriott downtown until I can find something permanent. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce proceedings." "Michael," Sarah said as he reached for the door handle. "For what it's worth, if you had just told me the truth about your test results, we could have worked through this together. We could have explored treatment options, considered adoption, figured out a path forward. Your infertility wasn't the problem. Your lies were." He turned to look at her one last time, and she saw a flicker of something that might have been regret. "You say that now. But if I had told you I was the reason we couldn't have kids, how long before you started looking at other men the way you look at babies in restaurants?" The accusation was so far from her character, so completely inconsistent with the loyal, devoted wife she'd been, that Sarah almost laughed. "I would have loved you through anything, Michael. That's what you never understood. I didn't need you to be perfect. I needed you to be honest." "Well," he said, opening the door to the cold March night, "I guess we'll never know." After he left, Sarah walked through their apartment, her apartment now, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The oppressive weight of walking on eggshells, of constantly doubting her own perceptions, of trying to be small enough to fit into Michael's version of reality, had lifted. She called Dr. Foster's emergency line. "Sarah, are you safe?" "What happened?" "He's gone," Sarah said, and started crying, not from grief but from relief. "He's finally gone. How do you feel?" Sarah considered the question, taking inventory of her emotional state. Free, terrified, angry, but mostly free. Those are all normal responses. What you did tonight took incredible courage. What happens now? Now you heal. Now you remember who you were before he convinced you that you were broken. Now you build the life you want instead of the life he told you that you could have. After they hung up, Sarah poured herself a glass of wine, the first alcohol she'd had in 3 years of trying to optimize her fertility, and sat in her quiet living room. Tomorrow she would start divorce proceedings. She would figure out finances and living arrangements and all the practical aspects of rebuilding a life. But tonight, she would simply exist in the space between her old life and her new one, savoring the silence that came from not being constantly criticized, questioned, or made to feel inadequate. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Barrett fell asleep without checking her fertility app, without taking her temperature, without planning tomorrow's ovulation strategy. She fell asleep as simply Sarah, not a failed wife, not a defective woman, not a desperate baby-obsessed shell of herself. She fell asleep as a woman who had finally remembered her own worth. But Michael's parting threat echoed in her dreams. This isn't over. And in the morning, she would discover exactly what he meant by that. The first sign of Michael's hardball strategy came 3 days after he moved out. When Sarah's phone rang at 7:30 a.m., her mother-in-law's name flashed on the screen. "Patricia?" Sarah answered groggily, still adjusting to sleeping through the night without anxiety. "Sarah, honey, I just got off the phone with Michael." Patricia Barrett's voice carried the carefully modulated tone of someone delivering bad news. "He told me about your separation. I'm so sorry, dear." Sarah sat up in bed, instantly alert. Patricia had never called her directly before. All communication with Michael's family had always gone through him. "Thank you. I know this is difficult for everyone. He's devastated, you know. Absolutely devastated. He says you asked him to leave because of his medical condition." The words hit Sarah like ice water. She could practically hear Michael's version of events. "Sarah found out about my fertility problems and couldn't handle being married to a man who couldn't give her children. She abandoned me when I needed her most." "Patricia, I don't think Michael gave you the full story." "Oh, honey, I know you're hurting too. But to leave him over something he can't control? Something you both could work through together? I never thought you were that kind of person. That kind of person." The phrase hung in the air, loaded with judgment and disappointment. Sarah could see Michael's strategy unfolding with surgical precision. He was positioning himself as the victim of her shallow, cruel abandonment, painting her as a woman who'd married him for his fertility and discarded him when he proved defective. "It's not about his fertility problems," Sarah said carefully. "There were other issues in our marriage. I'm sure there were, dear. Marriage is never easy. But in sickness and in health, for better or worse, those vows mean something, don't they?" The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Patricia delivering gentle but devastating criticism disguised as concern. By the time they hung up, Sarah felt like she'd been emotionally eviscerated by someone wielding a scalpel made of disappointed motherly love. Her phone immediately rang again. This time it was Michael's sister, Jennifer, calling from Seattle. "Sarah, I can't believe what Michael told me." "You left him because he can't have kids? That's so unlike you." The same script, delivered with the same tone of bewildered disappointment. Sarah tried to explain about the lies, the manipulation, the affair, but Jennifer cut her off. "Look, I know my brother isn't perfect, but to divorce him over a medical condition, and right now, when he's at his lowest point, I have to say I'm really disappointed in you." By noon, Sarah had fielded calls from 3 more of Michael's family members and 2 mutual friends, all expressing their shock and disappointment at her heartless decision to abandon her husband in his time of medical crisis. The consistency of their language, the way they all used phrases like medical, condition, and time of need, made it clear they were working from the same narrative Michael had provided. Sarah called Dr. Foster in desperation. "He's telling everyone I left him because of his infertility," she said, pacing around her apartment. "He's making me sound like a monster who abandoned my sick husband." "This is a common tactic among abusers," Dr. Foster replied. "It's called DARVO, deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. Michael is denying the psychological abuse, attacking your character, and positioning himself as the victim of your cruelty. But they believe him. His whole family thinks I'm this shallow, heartless person who couldn't love him through a medical problem." Sarah, you can't control what other people believe, especially when they're getting their information from a skilled manipulator. Your job right now is to protect yourself and focus on healing. But what about the truth? What about what he actually did to me? The truth will come out eventually. But right now, Michael has the advantage. He's had years to establish himself as charming and trustworthy with these people, and he got to tell his version first. Don't waste your energy trying to convince people who are already committed to believing him. Dr. Foster was right, but the advice felt impossible to follow. Sarah had spent 3 years internalizing blame for their marriage problems. Now Michael was externalizing that blame, spreading it to their entire social circle. The isolation she'd felt during their marriage was expanding, encompassing friends and family who now viewed her with suspicion and disappointment. The next blow came from an unexpected source, her own sister, Amy. "Sarah, I got the strangest call from Michael yesterday," Amy said when she phoned that evening. "He sounded really broken up. He said you'd asked him to leave and that he was worried about your mental state." "My mental state?" "He said the fertility stuff had become an obsession for you, and that when you found out about his test results, you kind of snapped. He's worried you might do something drastic." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Michael wasn't just positioning himself as the victim, he was laying groundwork to have her declared mentally unstable. If he could convince people she'd had some kind of psychological break, it would explain away anything she might say about his abuse and manipulation. "Amy, you know me. Do I seem unstable to you?" "No, but you have been under a lot of stress. And the way you've talked about wanting kids these past few years, it's been pretty intense. Maybe Michael's right that you need professional help processing this. You've been under a lot of stress." Even her own sister was buying into Michael's narrative that Sarah's response to 3 years of psychological abuse was evidence of mental instability, rather than reasonable reactions to unreasonable treatment. "I am getting professional help. I've been seeing Dr. Foster for months." "Right, the therapist Michael mentioned. He said she's been encouraging you to blame him for your fertility problems instead of helping you accept reality." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Michael had not only stolen her truth, he'd weaponized her therapy against her, twisting Dr. Foster's validation into evidence of professional malpractice that was enabling Sarah's delusions. "Amy, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Sarah said. "Michael has been lying to me for over a year. He had an affair. He hid his medical records while making me believe I was infertile. He manipulated and gaslighted me for 3 years. The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. "Sarah, honey, that's a pretty serious accusation. Are you sure you're not misinterpreting? I have evidence. Text messages, medical records, documentation of everything." "Okay, but even if some of that is true, and I'm not saying it's not, don't you think leaving him was kind of extreme? Couldn't you have worked through it in counseling?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Even when presented with evidence of Michael's betrayal, her own sister thought she should have stayed and tried to fix it. The narrative Michael had constructed was so powerful, so perfectly calibrated to make her look unreasonable, that even people who loved her were questioning her judgment. That weekend, Sarah made the mistake of going to their usual coffee shop in Harvard Square. The barista, Jenny, who'd served them countless times over the past 3 years, looked at her with obvious discomfort. "Hey, Sarah, how are you doing?" "I'm okay. Thanks for asking. I saw Michael earlier this week. He looked pretty rough." Jenny's tone carried a subtle accusation. "He said you guys are separating?" "Yes, we are. That's too bad. You guys always seemed so happy together." The way Jenny said it implied that the happiness had been Sarah's responsibility to maintain. Sometimes things are more complicated than they appear. Jenny nodded sympathetically, but Sarah could see the judgment in her eyes. Michael had obviously been there, playing the role of the heartbroken husband abandoned by his cruel wife. He'd probably mentioned his fertility problems, maybe even hinted that Sarah couldn't love a man who wasn't whole. Walking home, Sarah realized the full scope of Michael's strategy. He wasn't just controlling the narrative of their divorce. He was systematically destroying her reputation and social support network. Every conversation, every encounter, every seemingly casual mention of their separation was designed to isolate her further and position him as the sympathetic victim of her unreasonable expectations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Hope you're doing okay. I know this is hard on both of us. Just want you to know I don't hold any grudges. I understand you're dealing with a lot right now." The message was a masterpiece of manipulation. On the surface, it appeared generous and mature, a man extending grace to the wife who'd hurt him. But Sarah could read the subtext. I'm the reasonable one here. I'm the victim who's being magnanimous toward his unstable ex-wife. She screenshotted the message and sent it to Dr. Foster with a note. Is this what gaslighting looks like? Dr. Foster's response came quickly. Classic manipulation. He's creating documentation that makes him look reasonable while implying you're not. Don't respond. Anything you say can and will be used against you. That evening, Sarah's phone rang with yet another call from Michael's circle. This time his college roommate Brad, who lived in New York. Sarah, I just heard about you and Mike. Man, I'm really sorry. He sounds devastated. Thank you, Brad. He didn't want to get into details, but he mentioned something about fertility issues. That's rough. I know how much you both wanted kids. Sarah closed her eyes, recognizing the setup. Brad was fishing for her side of the story, but anything she said would be reported back to Michael and potentially used against her. It's complicated, she said simply. I bet. Look, I don't know what happened between you two, but Mike's one of the good ones, you know? Whatever's going on, I hope you guys can work it out. Sometimes marriage means sticking together even when things get hard. Sometimes marriage means sticking together even when things get hard. The implication was clear. Sarah had failed as a wife by not sticking together when Michael faced medical challenges. After she hung up, Sarah sat in her apartment and tried to process the full extent of her situation. Michael wasn't just leaving their marriage. He was scorching the earth behind him, ensuring that she would emerge from their divorce not just alone, but branded as the kind of woman who abandoned her husband when he needed her most. He'd turned their entire social circle against her using a perfectly crafted lie that contained just enough truth to be believable. Yes, he had fertility problems. Yes, she had left him because of those problems. But he'd omitted the crucial details, the lies, the manipulation, the affair, the systematic psychological abuse that had made their marriage unbearable. The elegant simplicity of his deception was breathtaking. He'd reduced 3 years of complex marital dysfunction to a simple story. Loving husband develops fertility problems, selfish wife can't handle it and abandons him. And everyone believed it. Sarah opened her laptop and began documenting every call, every conversation, every instance of Michael's narrative spreading through their social network. If she was going to survive his smear campaign, she needed evidence of his systematic character assassination. But as she typed, she realized something that chilled her to the bone. Michael hadn't just planned his exit strategy from their marriage. He'd planned her complete social destruction as revenge for discovering his lies. The man she'd married wasn't just a cheater or a liar. He was someone far more dangerous, someone who would systematically destroy another person's life to protect his own reputation. And he was just getting started. 2 weeks after Michael's departure, Sarah received a call that would change everything. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's voice carried an unusual tension when her receptionist put her through. Sarah, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I have some information that I think you need to hear, but I want to be very careful about patient confidentiality laws. Sarah's pulse quickened. What kind of information? It's about your fertility workup from last year. I've been reviewing your file in preparation for transferring your records, and I noticed some irregularities. What do you mean? Dr. Walsh paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. Sarah, I need to ask you a difficult question. During your treatment with me, did you ever take any medications or supplements that Michael provided or suggested? The question seemed to come from nowhere. Supplements? I mean, he bought me prenatal vitamins sometimes when he was at the pharmacy, and he got me those fertility teas from the health food store. Why? Another long pause. Sarah, I think you should come in. Today, if possible. There's something we need to discuss that I don't want to talk about over the phone. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in Dr. Walsh's office, her hands trembling as the doctor laid out a series of test results on the desk between them. Sarah, these are your hormone panels from the past 18 months. I've been analyzing them with fresh eyes, and I've noticed a pattern that concerns me deeply. Dr. Walsh pointed to a series of numbers Sarah didn't understand. Your prolactin levels were consistently elevated during the period when you were trying to conceive. Significantly elevated. High prolactin can suppress ovulation and make conception extremely difficult. But you never mentioned that before, because at the time I attributed it to stress. Elevated prolactin is common in women experiencing fertility anxiety. But looking at the pattern now, along with some other factors, Dr. Walsh met Sarah's eyes directly. Sarah, I have reason to believe your prolactin levels were artificially elevated. The room seemed to tilt around Sarah. Artificially? What does that mean? It means someone may have been giving you substances that would increase your prolactin levels and suppress your fertility. Without your knowledge. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. You think someone was sabotaging my fertility? On purpose? Dr. Walsh opened another folder. I ran some research after your last visit. Certain medications can dramatically increase prolactin levels. Antipsychotics, anti-nausea drugs, some herbal supplements. If someone wanted to temporarily suppress a woman's fertility without her knowledge, there are ways to do it. Sarah's mind raced back through the past 3 years. The prenatal vitamins Michael brought home without being asked. The fertility teas he'd insisted would help her relax and optimize her cycles. The way he'd taken over purchasing her supplements, claiming he wanted to help manage the stress of fertility treatments. The fertility teas, she whispered. He brought them home every few weeks, said they were specially formulated for women trying to conceive. Doctor. Walsh nodded grimly. Sarah, I can't prove anything without having those supplements tested. But if someone was systematically drugging you to prevent conception while making you believe you were infertile, that would be criminal. The full scope of Michael's betrayal crashed over Sarah like a tsunami. It wasn't enough that he'd hidden his own infertility while making her believe she was broken. It wasn't enough that he'd cheated on her while letting her blame herself for their fertility problems. He had actively, deliberately sabotaged her body's ability to conceive, turning her into an unwitting victim of reproductive coercion while she underwent invasive medical procedures to fix a problem he was causing. I need to throw up, Sarah said, bolting from the chair toward Dr. Walsh's private bathroom. 20 minutes later, after Sarah had emptied her stomach and tried to compose herself, Dr. Walsh continued the conversation with the delicacy of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. Sarah, if my suspicions are correct, your fertility was likely never compromised. The elevated prolactin levels, if artificially induced, would have resolved within weeks of stopping the substances causing them. Are you saying I could have gotten pregnant? This whole time if he hadn't been… She couldn't finish the sentence. I'm saying it's very possible. Your baseline hormone levels, when they weren't artificially elevated, were excellent. Your reproductive anatomy is perfectly normal. There's no medical reason you couldn't conceive with proper timing and without external interference. Sarah sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what she'd just learned. Michael hadn't just hidden his infertility. He'd chemically prevented her from conceiving while convincing her that her body was the problem. He'd turned her into a victim of reproductive abuse while she thanked him for buying her fertility supplements. What do I do now? She asked finally. First, we get you clean. No supplements, no teas, nothing that didn't come directly from a pharmacy with your name on it. Then we wait for your hormone levels to normalize and see what your natural fertility looks like. And legally? Dr. Walsh's expression darkened. Sarah, what I'm describing, if it can be proven, constitutes criminal reproductive coercion. It's a form of domestic violence. You would need to document everything, preserve any remaining supplements for testing, and probably speak with both a lawyer and law enforcement. Walking to her car after the appointment, Sarah felt like she was moving through a different universe than the one she'd inhabited that morning. The Michael she'd married hadn't just been manipulative or unfaithful, he'd been literally poisoning her reproductive system while convincing her she was medically defective. The cruelty was breathtaking. While she'd undergone painful medical procedures, while she'd blamed herself for their failure to conceive, while she'd internalized his accusations about being obsessive and demanding, he'd been systematically drugging her to ensure she couldn't get pregnant. But there was something else, something that cut even deeper than the reproductive coercion. Michael had watched her suffer. He'd sat in doctors' offices while she was poked and prodded and tested. He'd held her while she cried over negative pregnancy tests. He'd comforted her through the invasive procedures she'd endured trying to fix her supposedly broken body, all while knowing that he was the one breaking it. That evening, Sarah called Dr. Foster with shaking hands. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "You sound—" "He was drugging me." The words came out flat and emotionless. "For 3 years. Michael was putting something in my supplements to prevent me from getting pregnant." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Dr. Foster spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "Sarah, that's an extremely serious allegation. Are you certain?" Sarah explained about Dr. Walsh's discovery, the elevated prolactin levels, the pattern of Michael controlling her supplements. As she talked, she could hear Dr. Foster taking notes. "This explains so much," Dr. Foster said finally. "The timing of when you started feeling obsessive about fertility, it coincides with when he would have started the supplementation. The way your anxiety and depression increased over time, elevated prolactin can cause mood disturbances." "Sarah, you weren't going crazy. You were being poisoned." The word poisoned hit like a sledgehammer. Sarah had been thinking in terms of reproductive coercion and fertility sabotage, clinical terms that somehow made it feel less personal. But Dr. Foster was right. Michael had been systematically poisoning her while convincing her that her reactions to being poisoned were evidence of her mental instability. "I trusted him," Sarah whispered. "I thanked him for taking care of me. I felt guilty that he had to deal with a wife who was so broken and demanding." "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. What Michael did to you, if Dr. Walsh is correct, constitutes severe domestic violence. This wasn't just emotional abuse or infidelity. This was systematic chemical assault designed to control your reproductive autonomy while destroying your psychological well-being. What do I do? First, you document everything. Every supplement, every tea, every medication he ever gave you. Second, you preserve any remaining substances for testing. Third, you contact a lawyer who specializes in domestic violence cases. And fourth, Dr. Foster paused. Fourth, you prepare for the possibility that Michael will escalate when he realizes you know what he did." That night, Sarah went through her apartment with the methodical precision of a crime scene investigator. In the bathroom cabinet, she found 3 bottles of the prenatal vitamins Michael had purchased. Expensive brands she'd never heard of, not the standard options from CVS or Target. In the kitchen, she discovered 2 boxes of the fertility tea he'd brought home just weeks before their separation. She photographed everything, then carefully sealed the supplements and teas in separate bags. Tomorrow, she would take them to an independent lab for analysis. But as she sat in her living room, surrounded by evidence of Michael's systematic betrayal, Sarah realized something that changed everything. She was done being Michael's victim. For 3 years, she'd internalized his criticism, accepted his manipulation, believed his lies about her body and her sanity. Even during their divorce, she'd been playing defense, trying to prove she wasn't the unstable, selfish woman he'd portrayed her as. No more. Michael had made a critical error. In his arrogance, in his certainty that he'd covered his tracks perfectly, he'd left evidence of crimes that went far beyond adultery or emotional abuse. He'd committed felonies. He'd engaged in reproductive coercion that could result in criminal charges and civil liability that would destroy not just his reputation, but his freedom. And Sarah was going to make sure the world knew exactly what kind of man Michael Barrett really was. She opened her laptop and began typing. Not a journal entry or a therapeutic exercise, but a systematic documentation of every detail she could remember about Michael's control over her supplements, her medical care, and her fertility journey. She was building a case, piece by piece, that would expose not just his lies, but his crimes. Michael thought he'd won by destroying her reputation and isolating her from their social circle. He thought his carefully crafted narrative about the heartless wife who'd abandoned her infertile husband would protect him from consequences. He was wrong. Sarah Barrett was about to become the most dangerous person in Michael's life, a victim who had proof of his crimes and nothing left to lose. The real war was just beginning. The laboratory results arrived on a Thursday morning in April, delivered via secure email with the clinical detachment of a pathology report. Sarah stared at her laptop screen in the quiet of her apartment, reading words that confirmed her worst suspicions and vindicated her sanity in equal measure. Analysis of submitted supplements reveals presence of domperidone and chasteberry extract at levels significantly higher than therapeutic doses. Combined effects would result in marked prolactin elevation and suppression of ovulation. Dr. Walsh's suspicions had been correct. For over 2 years, Michael had been systematically poisoning her reproductive system while positioning himself as her supportive partner in their fertility journey. The prenatal vitamins he'd lovingly purchased contained drugs that prevented conception. The fertility teas he'd brought home were chemical cocktails designed to sabotage her body's natural processes. Sarah forwarded the lab results to her new attorney, Rebecca Chen, a specialist in domestic violence cases who'd taken one look at Sarah's documentation and declared it the most sophisticated case of reproductive coercion she'd seen in 15 years of practice. Her phone rang within minutes. "Sarah, these results are devastating." Rebecca's voice carried the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd just received a smoking gun. Domperidone isn't even legal in the United States without a prescription. Your husband had to obtain this from overseas sources or through illegal channels. What does that mean legally? It means we're looking at multiple felonies: assault with a dangerous substance, fraud, possibly conspiracy charges if he worked with someone to obtain the drugs. This goes way beyond divorce court. This is criminal territory. Sarah felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. For months, she'd been defending herself against Michael's narrative about her supposed mental instability and heartless abandonment. Now she had proof that he was a criminal who'd spent years systematically abusing her while making her believe she was the problem. What's our next move? 2 tracks. First, we file criminal charges. This evidence is solid enough for the district attorney's office to take seriously. Second, we use this in the divorce proceedings. Massachusetts law allows for dramatic shifts in asset division when one spouse has committed crimes against the other. After the call, Sarah sat in her apartment and tried to process the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. Michael hadn't just been unfaithful or manipulative. He'd been conducting a years-long campaign of chemical assault designed to destroy her fertility while convincing her she was mentally defective. But alongside her rage was something else: profound relief. For 3 years, she'd questioned her own sanity, wondering why she felt increasingly anxious and depressed, why her desire for children had seemed to consume her rational thought processes. Now she knew the truth. Her emotional distress hadn't been pathological obsession, but reasonable responses to being systematically drugged. The domperidone explained her mood swings, her increasing anxiety, her inability to think clearly about anything beyond getting pregnant. She hadn't been losing her mind. She'd been fighting against chemical interference with her brain chemistry while trying to conceive under impossible circumstances. Dr. Foster confirmed this during their emergency session that afternoon. Sarah, elevated prolactin doesn't just suppress fertility, it affects mood, cognition, and emotional regulation. The irritability, the obsessive thoughts, The feeling like you couldn't think about anything else. Those weren't character flaws. Those were neurochemical symptoms of being drugged. He convinced me I was crazy, Sarah said, the words coming out flat and factual rather than emotional. He made me believe that wanting children was pathological, that my frustration with our failure was evidence of mental illness. That's what makes this so insidious. Michael created the very symptoms he then used to discredit you. It's psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind. Sarah left Dr. Foster's office with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The self-doubt that had plagued her throughout their marriage, the constant questioning of her own motivations and reactions, had evaporated. She knew exactly who she was and what had been done to her. More importantly, she knew what she was going to do about it. That evening, she called her sister Amy. "Amy, I need you to listen to something without interrupting." Sarah's voice carried a steel that Amy had never heard before. For 20 minutes, Sarah laid out everything: the hidden medical records, the affair, the reproductive coercion, the laboratory results proving she'd been systematically drugged. She spoke with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence, backing up each claim with documentation. When she finished, the silence on the other end stretched so long that Sarah wondered if Amy had hung up. "Jesus Christ," Amy finally whispered. "Sarah, I believed him. When he said you'd had some kind of breakdown, I believed him. I'm so sorry." You had no reason not to believe him. His story made sense. Wife becomes obsessed with getting pregnant, finds out husband is infertile, can't handle reality, and leaves. Simple, clean, reasonable. But you have proof now. Actual proof of what he did. I have proof of criminal activity that makes his affair look like a parking ticket by comparison. Amy was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to destroy him," Sarah said simply. Systematically, legally, and completely. He spent 3 years convincing everyone that I was unstable and selfish. Now I'm going to show them exactly what kind of monster they were defending. The transformation in Sarah's voice was startling. Gone was the uncertain, self-doubting woman who'd questioned her own perceptions for years. In her place was someone with the cold precision of a surgeon and the focused rage of someone who'd discovered the full extent of their betrayal. "Sarah, maybe you should think about what? About being reasonable? About taking the high road? Amy, he poisoned me for 3 years while watching me undergo invasive medical procedures to fix problems he was causing. He convinced our entire social circle that I was a heartless bitch who abandoned my sick husband. He's currently living with his pregnant girlfriend while telling everyone that I couldn't handle being married to an infertile man." Sarah's voice remained eerily calm as she continued. "I tried the high road. I tried therapy and communication and understanding. I tried being the bigger person while he systematically destroyed my sanity and reputation. I'm done being reasonable." Over the following weeks, Sarah orchestrated her counterattack with military precision. She hired a private investigator to document Michael's affair and his living situation with Linda. She worked with Rebecca to prepare both criminal charges and civil litigation. She systematically gathered evidence of every lie Michael had told, every manipulation he'd employed, every instance of his character assassination campaign. But the most crucial element of her strategy was patience. "We don't reveal our hand until we can play every card at once," Rebecca advised. "Let him continue thinking he's won. Let him get comfortable with his new narrative and his new life. The harder his fall, the more complete his destruction will be." Meanwhile, Sarah began rebuilding herself in ways that went far beyond legal strategy. She moved to a new apartment in Back Bay, closer to her MBA program at Harvard. She threw herself into her studies with the focused intensity of someone who'd been artificially prevented from thinking clearly for years. Without the domperidone suppressing her cognitive function, Sarah found her mind sharper than it had been since before her marriage. She completed her MBA with distinction, specializing in corporate strategy and crisis management, skills she was applying to her own situation with devastating effectiveness. She also began working with a new physician, Dr. Melissa Santos, to understand her body's recovery from years of chemical manipulation. "Your hormone levels have completely normalized," Dr. Santos reported during a 6-month follow-up appointment. Prolactin, estrogen, luteinizing hormone, everything is in perfect range. From a fertility standpoint, you're completely healthy. What are my chances of conceiving naturally? Excellent! Based on your current hormone profile and reproductive anatomy, I'd estimate your fertility at the level of a woman 5 years younger. Whatever was suppressing your reproductive function has been completely eliminated from your system. Sarah smiled grimly. Michael had spent 3 years making her believe she was defective, while the truth was that she'd always been perfectly capable of conceiving, if he hadn't been actively preventing it. 6 months after the laboratory results confirmed her suspicions, Sarah was ready to execute her plan. The criminal charges were filed. The civil litigation was prepared. The private investigator had documented Michael's affair and financial assets with forensic precision. But Sarah's masterstroke was still to come. Through the investigator, she'd learned that Michael and Linda were planning a wedding, a small ceremony followed by a reception at Linda's parents' estate in Montecito. The guest list included everyone from Michael's family, all the mutual friends who'd believed his narrative about Sarah's mental breakdown, and the professional contacts who'd supported him through his difficult divorce. Michael, in his arrogance, had decided to send Sarah an invitation. The wedding invitation arrived with a handwritten note. Sarah, I know this might seem strange, but Linda and I would love for you to celebrate with us. I hope you can see this as a sign that we've all moved past the difficult period and found happiness. I think it would mean a lot to everyone to see that you're doing well and that there are no hard feelings. Michael. Rebecca read the invitation with the appreciation of a chess master recognizing a brilliant tactical error. He's inviting you to his wedding? After everything he's done? He thinks I'm still the broken woman he left behind, Sarah explained. He thinks I'll either refuse the invitation, proving I'm bitter and unstable, or show up looking pathetic and defeated, which validates his narrative about rescuing himself from a mentally ill wife. And what are you actually going to do? Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. I'm going to accept his invitation, and I'm going to give him exactly what he deserves. By the time Michael realized what Sarah had become, it would be far too late. The woman he'd systematically destroyed over 3 years had been reborn as someone infinitely more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. His perfect revenge was about to become her perfect vindication. Present day, Montecito, California. The moment Sarah stepped out of her Tesla with Emma and David flanking her and James emerging from the passenger side, she could see the exact instant Michael's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Mediterranean mansion, she watched him drop his champagne flute, watched Linda's face go white with shock, watched Patricia Barrett's mouth fall open in confused disbelief. The guests on the terrace had frozen in their conversations, their eyes fixed on the impossible sight before them. Sarah Matthews, the supposedly barren, mentally unstable ex-wife who'd abandoned her infertile husband in his time of need, had arrived at his wedding with living proof that everything he'd told them was a lie. "Mommy," Emma whispered, tugging on Sarah's navy dress. "Why is everyone staring at us?" "Because they're about to learn something very important about truth and lies, sweetheart," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the serene confidence of someone who held all the cards. James squeezed her hand. "You sure you're ready for this?" Sarah looked at him. This brilliant, kind man who'd loved her through her healing, who'd helped her remember what healthy relationships looked like, who'd given her the family Michael had spent years preventing her from having. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." They walked toward the mansion's entrance, and Sarah could see the ripple effect of their arrival spreading through the reception like wildfire. Guests were pointing, whispering, pulling out phones to capture what was clearly going to be an unforgettable moment. Michael appeared in the doorway, his face cycling through shock, panic, and desperate calculation. Behind him, Linda clutched her pregnant belly like a shield, her earlier glow replaced by the pallor of someone witnessing their partner's lies explode in real time. "Sarah," Michael managed, his voice strangled. You came? You invited me," she replied with a smile that could have frozen champagne. "I thought it was important for everyone to see how well I'm doing these days." Patricia Barrett pushed through the crowd of guests, her eyes darting between Sarah's twins and her son's ashen face. I don't understand. Michael, you said she couldn't. You said the fertility problems were his, Sarah finished smoothly. Not mine. Never mine. She reached into her Hermes bag, a gift from James when she'd graduated from Harvard with her MBA, and pulled out a manila envelope thick with documents. I brought wedding gifts. For everyone. Michael's eyes fixed on the envelope with the terror of a man recognizing his own death warrant. Sarah, don't what? Don't share the truth? Don't show our friends and family what really happened in our marriage. Sarah's voice remained conversational, but there was steel beneath the silk. Michael, you spent months telling these people I was mentally unstable, that I abandoned you when you needed me most. I think they deserve to know what actually transpired. Linda stepped forward, her voice shaky. Michael, what is she talking about? Sarah looked at Linda with something approaching pity. He hasn't told you about the domperidone, has he? Or the chasteberry extract, the illegal drugs he put in my supplements for 3 years to prevent me from conceiving while convincing me I was infertile? The words hit the assembled guests like physical blows. Sarah could see understanding, dawning on face after face as the implications sank in. The man they'd pitied as the victim of his wife's heartless abandonment had been systematically poisoning her while she underwent invasive medical procedures to fix problems he was causing. That's impossible, Patricia whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. Sarah opened the envelope and began distributing copies of documents with the efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Laboratory analysis of the supplements Michael provided. Medical records showing my artificially elevated prolactin levels. FBI forensics report on the illegal importation of controlled substances. FBI? Michael's voice cracked like a teenager's. Reproductive coercion is a federal crime, Michael, especially when it involves controlled substances obtained through international drug trafficking. Sarah's smile was radiant. Did you think I'd just quietly disappear after you spent 3 years chemically assaulting me? Jennifer, Michael's sister, stared at the laboratory reports with the horror of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. Michael, is this true? Did you drug her? It's not what it looks like, Michael began, but Sarah cut him off. It's exactly what it looks like. For 3 years, your brother fed me illegal drugs while I begged doctors to figure out why I couldn't get pregnant. He watched me undergo painful procedures, let me blame myself for our fertility problems, and convinced all of you that my frustration was evidence of mental illness. She gestured toward Emma and David, who were quietly playing with the champagne fountain, much to the delight of several guests who seemed desperate for any distraction from the unfolding catastrophe. These beautiful children are proof that I was never the problem. I was always perfectly capable of conceiving when I wasn't being poisoned. Brad, Michael's college roommate, looked at the forensics report with the expression of someone realizing they'd been defending a monster. Jesus, Mike, is this why she left you? Not because of your fertility problems, but because you were drugging her? I was protecting our marriage. Michael exploded, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. Do you have any idea what it's like to find out you're infertile? To know you can't give your wife the one thing she wants most? I was buying us time to figure out alternatives. By making me believe I was defective? Sarah's voice rose for the first time, carrying 3 years of suppressed rage. By watching me hate myself while you knew exactly why I couldn't get pregnant. By starting an affair while I was in fertility treatments. An affair? Linda's voice was barely a whisper. Sarah reached into her bag again, this time producing a stack of photographs that made Linda's face crumble. He was cheating on me with you for months before our separation. Linda. While I was being drugged and gaslit and convinced I was mentally unstable, your fiancé was planning his exit strategy with his pregnant mistress. The photographs scattered across the patio like fallen leaves. Michael and Linda in hotel rooms. Romantic dinners. Intimate moments that predated his separation from Sarah by at least 6 months. The timestamps on the images were clear and damning. Linda stared at the evidence of her own role as the other woman, her fairy tale romance revealed as a carefully orchestrated betrayal. Michael, you told me you were separated. You said Sarah had asked you to leave because of the fertility issues. I did separate from her. After I discovered your crimes, Sarah interjected. After I found your affair, your hidden medical records, and evidence that you'd been systematically sabotaging my reproductive health while making me believe I was the problem. Dr. Steinberg, who had apparently been invited as a family friend, stepped forward with the haunted expression of a man realizing he'd been manipulated by one of his patients. Mr. Barrett, did you deliberately conceal your semen analysis results from your wife? Michael looked around the patio at the faces of everyone he'd lied to, everyone he'd manipulated, everyone who'd believed his carefully crafted narrative about the heartless wife who couldn't love a man with medical problems. There was no escape, no way to spin this revelation into something sympathetic. She was obsessed, he said desperately. The fertility stuff consumed her. I was trying to protect her from additional stress while I figured out how to tell her about my results. By drugging her with illegal substances? James spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. By making her undergo medical procedures to treat problems you were causing. Michael's gaze fixed on James with naked hatred. And who the hell are you supposed to be? I'm her husband, James replied simply. The man who loves her for exactly who she is, fertility and all. The father of her children. The person who helped her heal from what you did to her. The word husband hit Michael like a physical blow. Not only had Sarah proven his lies about her infertility were false, she'd found someone who loved her, married her, and given her the family he'd spent years preventing her from having. Amy pushed through the crowd of guests, her face blazing with righteous fury. Michael, I defended you. When Sarah told me what you'd done, I thought she was exaggerating, maybe having some kind of breakdown. I told her to be more understanding about your medical condition. Because that's exactly what he wanted you to think, Sarah said gently. He turned everyone against me by telling a story that sounded reasonable on the surface. Wife becomes obsessed with pregnancy. Husband develops fertility problems. Wife can't handle it and leaves. Simple, clean, tragic. Except it was all lies, Patricia Barrett said, her voice hollow with shock. She looked at her son like she was seeing a stranger. Michael, how could you do this to someone you claimed to love? I did love her, Michael shouted, his composure completely shattered. But she was so demanding, so obsessed with having kids that she couldn't see anything else. I was trying to save our marriage. By preventing her from having the children she wanted while making her think she was broken? Jennifer shook her head in disgust. That's not love, Michael. That's torture. Sarah watched the dominoes fall with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent 2 years planning this moment with surgical precision. Every person who'd doubted her story, every friend who'd believed Michael's lies, every family member who'd judged her for abandoning her husband, they were all seeing the truth simultaneously, in devastating clarity. The criminal trial starts in 3 months, Sarah announced to the assembled crowd. Michael has been indicted on multiple felony charges related to reproductive coercion, assault with dangerous substances, and trafficking in controlled medications. The FBI investigation uncovered a network of illegal drug importation that he used to obtain the substances he fed me. Linda looked like she might faint. Criminal trial? Michael, you're going to prison? The prosecution is seeking 5 to 7 years, Sarah continued with clinical precision. Though my civil attorney thinks we can secure enough in damages to ensure he loses everything he values. His business, his assets, his reputation. Michael's face had gone from red to white to gray, cycling through the stages of a man watching his entire life implode in real time. You vindictive bitch. You can't prove I intended. Actually, I can. Sarah's voice cut through his protest like a scalpel. Because you documented everything, Michael. Your internet search history, your communications with overseas pharmaceutical suppliers, your careful timing of my supplement schedule to maximize prolactin elevation. You kept records of it all because you thought you were too smart to get caught. She pulled out one final document, a thick forensic analysis of Michael's electronic devices that the FBI had seized during their investigation. Turns out, when federal agents search someone's computer for evidence of drug trafficking, they find a lot of interesting things. The report detailed Michael's systematic research into fertility-suppressing drugs, his communications with illegal pharmaceutical suppliers, his careful documentation of Sarah's hormonal responses to different dosages. It was the diary of a man conducting a calculated campaign of reproductive abuse while meticulously recording his victim's deteriorating mental state. "You studied my reactions," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder at the depth of his cruelty. "You tracked how the drugs affected my mood, my cognitive function, my ability to think clearly. You turned me into a laboratory rat while convincing me I was mentally ill." The guests stood in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't a messy divorce or a case of he-said-she-said accusations. This was documented evidence of systematic criminal behavior that had destroyed an innocent woman's life while the perpetrator played the victim. Linda suddenly bent over, vomiting into the ornate planters that lined the patio. Whether from morning sickness or the shock of learning she was engaged to a man who'd spent years poisoning his previous wife, it was impossible to tell. "I think," Sarah said, looking around at the horrified faces surrounding her, "this would be a good time for me to take my children home." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Michael one last time. "Oh, and Michael, thank you for the wedding invitation. I can't think of a better venue to show everyone who you really are." As Sarah walked toward her car with James and the twins, she could hear the chaos erupting behind her. Guests arguing. Linda sobbing, Patricia Barrett demanding answers from her son. Michael's carefully constructed new life was disintegrating as thoroughly as he had once destroyed hers. Emma looked up at her mother as they reached the Tesla. "Mommy, why was everyone so upset?" "Because sometimes people tell lies to make themselves look better, sweetheart. And today, everyone learned the truth." "Are we going to see those people again?" Sarah glanced back at the mansion, where Michael stood alone on the patio as his wedding guests departed in disgusted groups. His new wife had disappeared, probably to reconsider her life choices. His family looked at him like he was a stranger. His friends were deleting his contact information. "No, baby," Sarah said, buckling Emma into her car seat. "We're never going to see those people again." As they drove away from Montecito, James reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. "How does it feel?" Sarah considered the question, taking inventory of her emotional state. The rage that had sustained her through 2 years of planning was gone, replaced by something lighter and infinitely more satisfying. "Complete," she said finally. "For the first time since I met Michael, I feel complete." She had her truth. She had her vindication. She had her family and her health and her future. Michael had nothing. No wife, no reputation, no freedom, no assets that wouldn't be seized to pay her civil judgment. The perfect revenge wasn't dramatic confrontation or elaborate schemes of destruction. It was simply living well, loving authentically, and ensuring that truth triumphed over manipulation. Sarah Barrett had died in that Cambridge apartment 3 years ago, poisoned and gaslit into believing she was defective. Sarah Matthews had been reborn from those ashes as someone infinitely stronger, someone who understood her own worth, someone who would never again allow another person to dim her light. As they drove north toward their real life, toward bedtime stories and family, dinners and the quiet joy of people who had found their way home to each other, Sarah realized that Michael Barrett had become exactly what he deserved to be: irrelevant. 5 years later, Sarah received a letter from the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. Michael was requesting approval to add her to his visitor list. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to ask for her forgiveness. Sarah read the letter once, then fed it through her home shredder without a second thought. She had children to pick up from school, a husband who loved her exactly as she was, and a life so full of genuine happiness that she couldn't spare even a moment's thought for the man who'd once tried to convince her she was worthless. Some victories, she'd learned, were best measured not in the destruction of one's enemies, but in the irrelevance they eventually achieved. Michael Barrett had wanted to be forgotten, erased from the narrative of her life as if he'd never existed. Sarah Matthews had been happy to oblige.